February 12, 1988. This is Edna Gerstel interviewing Tetsu Su Gi at her home, 1709 Cabrillo Avenue, Alhambra, California. Tetsu, why don't you begin by talking briefly about your educational background and then your beginning work history. You have
Since I was born in Central California and the family came south in 1917 and settled in the Lincoln Heights area, I went to all my grade school, high school was in that area. Went to UCLA as a math major and graduated in 1932. No, hold it. Graduated from UCLA in 36 and got my general secondary teaching credential in 1937. The period from 37 to the time of the war, because I was not able to get employment in the LA school system because of my minority background, I worked in a small grocery store owned by my parents. At the time of Pearl Harbor, when discussions were rampant about what was to happen with those of Japanese background, a neighbor was being visited by her mother, who came from Little Rock, Arkansas. She extended the invitation that if the time did come when everyone was to be evacuated, I was always welcome at her house. The time came and I left Los Angeles a week before everyone of Japanese background was frozen here. In that period, when the war did not end, I felt I needed to look for employment, and the government was announcing the building of two more, you want to call them evacuation centers or concentration camps in southern Arkansas. I saw in the paper where teachers were needed, and I looked into that possibility. The War Relocation Authority had set up office in Little Rock, and I went in to be interviewed by persons who had never seen a person of Japanese background. They were not able to answer my question of whether or not I would be admitted as an internee to one of the camps, or would I be accepted as a resident of Arkansas. They did not have the answer, and hence inquiry was made of officials in Washington, D.C. The answer was not definite, but I was told in all probability I would be accepted only as an internee. Since I did not intend to be, what word shall I use? Incarcerated, I guess. I then began to inquire of friends who had connections in other parts of the country. Through a fellow UCLA graduate who happened to be of the American Friends Service Committee. I heard of an opening in Chicago and was offered a part-time job with room and board at one of the Presbyterian neighborhood houses. Arrangements were made for me to get further part-time employment. During the next, it would be a couple of years, I worked at the settlement as a kind of activities worker in the area of physical, sports, crafts, and sewing. I had the opportunity of taking some of our settlement house youngsters to a Presbyterian summer camp outside of Holland, Michigan. It was at this time that I met a social work graduate of the University of Pittsburgh and learned that there was more to working with people besides concentrating on their acquiring skills in activities of different kinds. I made application to the University of Pittsburgh, and at that point they were on a kind of a system where they were unable to accept my application. I then made application to Western Reserve and was accepted, not for the fall for which I inquired, but for the spring semester. So I decided to continue my employment at the settlement house until the following year. In the meantime, the University of Pittsburgh was among those universities which were now opening their doors to students of Japanese background. The decision was made there that it would be through the School of Social Work that it would be easiest to achieve this policy. After I had already made up my mind that I would stay at the settlement house until spring and enter Western Reserve, I got notice from the University of Pittsburgh that they were looking for a guinea pig to their School of Social Work, one of Japanese background. It was not until further requests from the school and through my talking with persons who knew a little bit more about social work that I accepted the invitation and left Chicago on a weekend, and the following Monday started at the School of Social Work. In '46, I got my, what they were then calling the Master of Science, Social Work Administration. And worked in the settlement house in Pittsburgh. In the meantime, the war had ended and my parents and family had returned to the Los Angeles area. And as my parents were getting older, rather than to have the full responsibility on a sister, I decided I should be back here and explored work possibilities and accepted the job offered by the Church Welfare Bureau. I was there as a worker supervisor and then director of the group work division until 61. In the meantime, in this period, not only were Japanese war brides coming in from Japan and having difficulties, but also the third generation of Japanese were now becoming teenagers, and different kinds of problems were arising. Within the framework of the group work division, we offered services to War Brides Group and got involved with teenage girls groups primarily. The acting out that was done in, it was 1954, where one of the vernacular newspapers carried a large headline that teenage girls brawl. This was quite upsetting, not only to the community and the parents of the particular girls, but also of the local junior high school that the girls were attending. We were called in to see what we could do. I was involved personally with this group of girls and stayed with them for that period from 54 to June of 55, where there was much mediating which had to be done, not only among the girls themselves and with their parents, but also with the community agencies, the YWCA and the probation department being involved, plus 2 of the Japanese background Protestant churches. In the end, these girls, with graduation, went their separate ways, and that particular group was dissolved. Later, in 1958, the Japanese community had its first occasion where a teenage boy killed another teenager as a result of group competition. At this time, there were a number of us social workers of Japanese background who were concerned and met together to decide what our particular role ought to be and how we could help not only existing agencies, one of which was the children's, was it called a children's home? Everybody looked upon it as a home for orphan Japanese youngsters, which was far from the truth. Actually, it was an agency which took care of youngsters while families were settling themselves, whether it was through divorce, separation, death. But the youngsters did have some family connections. It was the executive of that agency who then began to develop additional programs under their auspices, and led to the development eventually, after 2 or 3 stages, of into the organization of the Japanese American Community Services, which had some connection with the Japanese Chamber of Commerce. At this point, I was then involved as a kind of consultant, but felt that my first responsibilities were to the agency, Church Welfare Bureau, and therefore did not want to get any more involved, quote, in the community with direct services of any kind. I was asked to be a member of a group of organizations, which was the Japanese American Citizens League, the Protestant Ministers Organization, the Buddhist Priests Organization, and the Gardeners Federation, which were the 4 strong organizations in the Japanese community, which were now exploring the possibilities of developing a senior citizens residence setup. From 1970, I met with the group, representatives from each of these 4 organizations, and there were 3 of us who, quote, represented the community at large. There were many decisions, problems, and so on, but the building was finally erected, and the residence itself was dedicated and opened in November of '75. I stayed on that board until 1980, and then resigned, feeling that 10 years on a board was long enough, in addition to my feeling that the agency, the residents, ought to be hiring a full-time social worker. I did not want to get involved with the personnel, the residents, and the solving the problems beginning to surface on a volunteer basis. I felt it was much too complicated.
What kind of problems?
Problems had to do with residents really not wanting to be there, but almost being pressured to coming in by their parents. Also those who were coming in it was almost like terminating their connections with their youngsters, which I felt was not good. Also, that there was, at the time of the initiation of the idea, there was widespread rumors about this being for underprivileged or low-income people, like being on welfare. so that it was not popular initially to become a resident of this center, of this housing project, of the senior citizens housing. It was not until a couple of years at least that we then had people clamoring to come in, because the attitude had changed. The facility, being located in the midst of Little Tokyo, made it a very convenient and also a safe residence for older people. In the meantime, problems were arising, especially on the west side, with more Negroes moving into what was initially practically an all Oriental neighborhood. So there were people who wanted to get out of where they were. In addition to the children of these senior citizens having increasing problems with their respective families and continuing to exist on a 3-generational pattern was not easy, especially as the youngsters became teenagers. So there were all these kinds of problems which showed themselves in a variety of ways, not only within the building, but also in the community at large. It was 1961 that Dr. Chano from the UCLA School of Social Welfare faculty received NIMH funds to conduct a study on Japanese and delinquency, because it was after the actual shooting and the follow-up that everybody became much more aware of what was going on in the Japanese community. So I left the Church Welfare Bureau to become a part of this study. And then I was with them, almost 2 years, when an opportunity arose for me to accept an offer from the Campfire Girls, which had received funds to provide services to 7-year-old girls who were already identified as not doing well in school, with the idea in mind that if we provided professionally trained group workers to meet with these youngsters and their parents, as well as communities, to not only affect the girls in their school achievement, but also work them into the regular Campfire organization. I was with this program for 2 years, and at the time the groups were probably approaching entering the Campfire organization in small ways. I left that program to take a summer assignment with the probation department, and specifically at the Las Palmas School for Girls, where a fellow social worker had provided the interim services for previous summers, but could not continue this particular summer. And her assignment was to substitute for regular senior probation officers who were taking their vacations. So I took on this assignment for the summer before I qualified, would that be the word to use, for a special project conducted under what was then known as the Bureau of Public Assistance. And from there, after that project was terminated, then I was assigned to a district office as a staff development person, and stayed there until a staff development person was assigned specifically to McLaren Hall. As is the practice with the public agencies, usually decisions are made as to where you can best make your contribution. And when I was about to be returned to a district assignment, I decided that perhaps this might be the best time for me to retire. So 1978, I retired from what then became the Department of Public Social Services. And it was, I retired in the spring. In the fall, I was approached by, I was trying to remember which came first, a unit sponsored by San Diego State, whose specific role was to help local school systems to follow through on what had become known as the Lau decision. This was the result of a case brought to federal attention in San Francisco for where the Chinese charged that students who were not proficient in English should be taught or helped in their native language first, and then moved into, shall we say, the general stream. This was a federal mandate, and this unit in San Diego was providing services in the area in which I happened to be living, the Alhambra school system, and a particular school which was located in Monterey Park. I was involved with that group in meeting with parents and helping them to not only communicate with one another, because we had several different racial groups involved. There were Chinese, who divided primarily into those of Cantonese background and those of Mandarin background, as well as persons who arrived with wealth, money, and those who came in after having spent time in what was kind of considered a point of entry, Old Chinatown, so that the two groups were very distinctive, and in many ways it affected the communication. Then there were those of Japanese background who had settled in what was known at large as a well-established middle income, upper middle income community. And then there, of course, there were those of Latin background. So they were developing a way in which the students not only could be helped on an individual basis and in groups, selected groups, but also there was a general complaint that some of the teachers that were being employed did not speak English in the way in which, quote, educated persons felt English should be spoken. In order to meet requirements that persons be bilingual, some teachers were hired whose educational experience was primarily in China. And this is what was causing the problem. I was with that program for one school year, and then was approached by a person within the LA's Unified School District who had an informal discussion with my sister, who had been employed in the school district for many years, about where she took her problems. She happened to mention that I was a social worker, and then he was interested. And I received a call from the person whose responsibility it was to find another person to join a project being conducted within the Board of Education. And this was an employees assistance program, which was to be developed following a pilot project conducted the year before as a result of concern about school personnel having problems, especially with alcohol. It started with these kind of problems, with this kind of a problem first, and then following the pilot project, it was determined that personnel had problems not only with alcohol but with other kinds of problems, and hence the emphasis then on an employee assistance program. I was with that program for, almost 3 years, when funding for that ran out. I guess my other social work activity has been strictly on a volunteer basis. And from 83 to this past year, 87, I volunteered at the senior citizens residence in Little Tokyo, in the office, feeling that I did not want to get involved with the problems of the residents, but I was there to be supportive to the manager and his wife, who was the assistant manager, and provided support as well as company to two persons who lived on the premises 7 days a week, worked together 7 days a week, and provided a kind of a respite and support for them. And I enjoyed that experience. At this point, I left this volunteer position because the manager and his wife moved, and I did not want to stay on. So I guess I'm just exploring other volunteer possibilities.
You are now.
Right. On this fine day in February of 1988.
Well, thank you.
That ended the career.
Thank you.